Welcome, everyone. This panel discussion is called Nuclear Truth-Telling in memory of Daniel Ellsberg. It's an honor to speak with three deeply informed and committed anti-nuclear activists. We should be having conversations like this every day, but how fitting it is that today, September 26th, is International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. That date was dedicated by the United Nations in 2014. My name is Chris Oppie. I'm a historian at the University of Massachusetts and the director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. I'll serve as moderator. This is the first of many events in a year-long program we're calling the Whistleblower Project, a series on public interest truth-telling. This is the first year of independent programming offered by the Ellsberg Initiative. So I want to begin with a few words about our goals and inspiration. Our mission is to promote public understanding, scholarship, and activism in support of compelling, democratic, and sustainable alternatives to militarism, authoritarianism, and environmental degradation. We are especially concerned about the overlapping threats posed by imperialism, nuclear weapons, climate change, and unwarranted government and corporate secrecy and surveillance. We seek to advance alternative practices and institutions that can enrich democracy, reduce international conflict, and create more equitable and enduring economies. Our work is inspired by Daniel Ellsberg, who died in June at the age of 92 after a long life devoted to nonviolent activism on behalf of peace, truth-telling, and nuclear disarmament. Our event tonight is dedicated to his memory. In 2019, the University of Massachusetts Amherst acquired Ellsberg's papers, a treasure trove of some 500 boxes of materials. His papers inspired several courses for students to be among the first to do research in the Ellsberg archive, as well as a two-day conference in 2021 marking the 50th anniversary of Dan's release of the Pentagon Papers to 19 US newspapers. As many of you know, the Pentagon Papers was a 7,000-page classified history of the Vietnam War that exposed decades of US government lies and deceit about the causes and conduct of the war. Now we're trying to create a permanent Ellsberg Institute for Peace and Democracy to advance his important legacy. Most Americans who know something about Ellsberg remember him for his opposition to the Vietnam War, but he was an equally fervent critic of nuclear weapons. And as with the Vietnam War, Ellsberg had once been a government consultant on nuclear weapons policy and a believer in nuclear deterrence. But he changed his mind about nuclear weapons just as dramatically and radically as he changed his mind on the Vietnam War. From the 1970s on, Dan was arrested roughly 80 times for acts of civil disobedience, and most of those protests were directed at the production and deployment of nuclear weapons. I highly recommend that you read Ellsberg's 2017 book, The Doomsday Machine: Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Also, for a short introduction to Dan's ideas on the subject, you might watch a podcast made by filmmaker Judith Ehrlich. It's called the Diffuse Nuclear War Podcast with Daniel Ellsberg, and we'll put a link to it in the chat. And looking ahead to next year, another filmmaker, Paul Jay, is finishing a full-length documentary about Ellsberg's anti-nuclear arguments. It's going to be called How to Stop a Nuclear War. So now let me briefly introduce tonight's guests. For more information about them, please check out the links in the chat. First, Ira Hefland is a physician and a key leader and founder of a handful of very important anti-nuclear organizations. He was, for example, co-founder and prior president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and also a past president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He is also on the international steering group for the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. The acronym is ICAN. Both of these latter two groups have received the Nobel Peace Prize. Hefland has also published some crucial articles on the medical consequences of nuclear war in the world's leading medical journals, including the New England Journal of Medicine. Cynthia Lazaroff is an expert on US-Russian relations and the founder of an organization called NuclearWakeUpCall.Earth, which is an international effort to promote and to move the world toward nuclear abolition, with a particular focus on reducing the escalating nuclear dangers in US-Russian relations. She also founded Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy, which focuses on mentoring women and girls in peace building and disarmament. Lazaroff is also the author of a harrowing article called Dawn of a New Armageddon, about her personal experience of the Hawaii nuclear missile alert in 2018, which I hope she will tell us about tonight. She's also the producer of many award-winning documentaries, most of them on US-Russian relations. Susi Snyder, who is speaking to us from the Netherlands very late at night, and we really appreciate that, is the program coordinator for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. She runs lots of ICANN's most important projects, including ones that effectively lobby companies and banks to stop investing in the production of nuclear weapons. For example, for more than a decade, she coordinated ICANN's Don't Bank on the Bomb project. She's also contributed a number of articles to important and relevant books, including A World Free of Nuclear Weapons and Sleepwalking to Armageddon. Snyder previously served as Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at their Geneva Secretariat. We had also invited a young anti-nuclear activist named Mari Faines, but unfortunately she had to cancel. But if you want to learn more about her important work, we're posting an article of hers in the chat. So now, at long last, let me turn to our panelists with some questions. To start, I'd mentioned earlier that Daniel Ellsberg had gone through this very dramatic personal transformation from nuclear war planner to anti-nuclear activist. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about your own journey. What is it that led you to become an activist for the abolition of nuclear weapons, and why is it so important to you? So why don't we start with Cynthia, then we'll go to Susi, and then we'll go to Ira. So Cynthia Lazaroff.
Thank you, Chris. I'm so honored to be here for this event in memory of our beloved Dan. He's been a huge inspiration in my life and work. And since his passing, this just keeps growing and growing. I'm forever grateful for everything he taught us, and of course, for everything he did for peace and for disarmament. So I'm just really honored to be here. Thank you. I actually first got started as a disarmament activist during the Cold War. But after the Cold War came to an end, I thought I could stop worrying about nuclear war. All of this changed for me in 2017 when I was asked to work on a film on US-Russia relations and nuclear dangers. And I interviewed dozens of top experts in the US and Russia. And pretty much everyone I spoke to awakened me to today's staggering nuclear danger. Mind you, this was 2017, 5 years before Ukraine. Our US former Secretary of Defense, William Perry, said to me that today we're at a greater risk of some sort of a nuclear catastrophe than we were during the Cold War, and that most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. He said, because we don't understand the dangers, we make no serious attempt to repair the hostility between the US and Russia. And so we're allowing ourselves to sleepwalk into another catastrophe. We must wake up. That was a really devastating kind of personal revelation moment for me, because I realized that I'd been sleepwalking since the end of the Cold War. And I came home from those interviews here to Hawaii at the height of the fire and fury tensions between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And we were actually getting instructions from our government about how to prepare for a nuclear attack and how to survive a nuclear attack, because we were actually marked as a target on Pyongyang's map of nuclear death. So all of this was present in my awareness on the morning of January 13th, 2018, when I was one of over 1 million people across the Hawaiian Islands who all got this message on our cell phones: ballistic missile threat, inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. And at first it was this feeling of, is this real? This can't be real. And so we started to try to call 911, but we couldn't get through because everyone was trying to call 911 at the same time. And then my partner said to me, well, I don't know if this is real or not, but I'm going to go get the girls. Our younger daughters were 7 miles away in the town of Kapa'a. And he rushed to go out the door. And I said, wait a second, we need a plan. If it is real, I don't want to be separated. And he said, call me in the car and we'll figure it out. So he left and I stood there dazed, and I thought, who do I know who's going to know? And I immediately thought of my dear friend, Felicia Cowden, who's a journalist, and she's the first to know anything on the island. Everybody takes her phone call. And so I started dialing. I left her a message. I texted her. I checked her Facebook page, nothing. And after what seemed like an eternity, she called me back and she said, Cynthia, the county's telling us to take shelter. And for me, that was just a moment of, okay, this is real. I've got to take this seriously. And so the first thing was, where do we go? There are no designated nuclear shelters in the state of Hawaii. And so we decided to shelter in a cave, which was the most sealed environment we could think of, which is on a neighbor's property. We agreed to meet there. And then it was, well, what do I take with me? And I looked down at my phone and it had 12% charge. And I thought, oh no, what am I going to do? So then I thought, okay, I think there are lights in the cave, so maybe there's an electrical outlet. And so I grabbed a bag and I just started throwing things in it. My phone charger, my phone, my computer charger, my purse, my passport, then a shawl to wrap around my face in case of radiation, and leggings to put on my leg. And then I thought, food and water. I've done nothing to prepare my family for this. We've been instructed by the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency to stock 1 gallon of water per day per person for 14 days in the event of a nuclear attack, and enough canned food for 14 days. And I looked on the shelf and there were 2 small bottles of water. I threw them in a bag, and then I grabbed a bunch of bananas and threw them in the bag, and I was out the door. And I jumped in the car because even though the cave is only about a 7-minute walk, I didn't know how many minutes I had. And it was only when I got into the car and started driving that I allowed myself to think about my eldest daughter, who had just left for Los Angeles a few days before. And I think if I'd thought of her a moment earlier, I wouldn't have been able to organize myself to leave. So I thought, I've got to let her know what's going on. And I called and it was ringing and ringing and she wasn't picking up. And I parked the car and I started running towards the foot of the steps to the cave. And just as I got to the foot of the steps of the cave, she picked up. And I said, Mackenzie, I don't know if you've heard, but we've all gotten this message on our cell phones that we're going to be hit by a ballistic missile. And we're going to shelter in the cave. And I'm going to call you again if I can, but I just want you to know I love you. And she said, Mom, I love you too. And at that moment, time stopped for me. I just stood there frozen and I didn't want to let her go. And then I thought, wait a second, what if this isn't one nuclear missile from North Korea, but what if this is many nuclear missiles from Russia coming to us and many from us going back to them? What if this is the beginning of one of those accidental nuclear wars that Secretary Perry and Gorbachev and others that I interviewed are so worried about, and Dan also. And then as I stood there thinking this, suddenly I heard, Mom, go. And Mackenzie jolted me out of this. And I said, I love you. And I started running up the steps to the cave. And just as I got to the door of the cave, it opened. And it was my neighbor, Colleen. She was walking out and she was smiling. And she said, it was a false alarm. So it took our government 38 minutes to get the word out that it was a false alarm. And even with everything I knew about nuclear weapons and nuclear war was unimaginable to me until I went through those 38 minutes. Now this experience lives inside of me as a mother, as a human being, and it's never going to go away until we eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. So this is why this work is deeply personal for me. This is why I'm working on abolition. And, I just know that the only way to eliminate the nuclear risk 100% is to eliminate nuclear weapons. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. What a moving story. Listening to it, I couldn't help but think about the sort of what ifs that are implicit in that story. What if the United States had thought it was this a real attack and had launched on the warning of that? And then we were in a situation where no cave is really going to protect anybody.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, Susi.
Gosh, I'm still holding my breath. And I can imagine, Cynthia, how you must have held your breath, 38 minutes of holding your breath and just gasping at every moment. And it's that kind of, these are the human stories that transform us, that when people learn about this, and I've known you for a while and I've heard bits and pieces, but I've never heard you tell the story quite like this. This is the what ifs, this is the questions like this that can transform us and that make us ask, how is this possible? How is this just? How is it okay that this is allowed to happen, that this, Kennedy described as a sword of Damocles hanging over our head, that this is allowed to swing for generations now over our heads. And, my story is more of a one, I come at this not from that kind of my own personal experience, but more from sharing the stories of others, sharing stories of radical injustice. And, I've always been a bit of a radical in some ways. And, when I was in high school, it was amazing because I would ditch class and go to protests to fight budget cuts. And because they were cutting budgets in our school. And I remember a protest against these budget cuts. There was a poster from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'll never forget this poster. And it said, how come the Navy has all the money they need for a bomber, but our school has to hold a bake sale to buy books? And that was the reality of what was happening. That was, our school, and there was a well-off school, but nevertheless, we didn't have money from the school district to pay for sports equipment, to pay for books. We were using a lot of old, outdated, questionable history texts, things like that, we just didn't have the resources because those resources were diverted. And I thought, well, this is unjust. This is not fair. And it seemed wrong. And a few years later, I learned how powerfully wrong it could be. I was lucky enough to meet an elder from the Western Shoshone Nation, Corbin Harney. And he explained to me that his family and his relations were forced off of their traditional lands that they still held by right, by treaty agreement with the US, so that the United States government could blow up atomic bombs outside of Las Vegas. And I thought, well, that is seriously messed up. That is wrong. And it's painfully wrong. And soon after meeting Corbin, I met Sumateru Taniguchi. And he's known as the postman of Nagasaki. And this was a man who was so brave and who astonished me with his bravery. He stood up in front of a room full of strangers, a packed room full of strangers. The man lifted his shirt and he showed everyone his heartbeat, which was clearly visible. You could see this from the back of the room. You could see his heart beating. And it was because his chest was so caved in because he had spent months recovering, lying on his front from the bombing of Nagasaki. I'll never forget this man who stood up and shared this in a room full of strangers. Like, this courage to try to draw attention to this just unbelievable injustice, and to cause that kind of harm, to continue to threaten that kind of harm, to continue to make the materials to do that kind of harm. To me, it was wrong. And so I think about it, and I thought about the power to do it again, and to do it 100 times or 1,000 times over. This contamination, this legacy left behind by these injustices. It was the wrongest thing I had ever heard of. And I thought, well, I can be creative. I can, put my energy I wanted to put my energy to do something good in the world. And so I said, all right, I'm going to work to stop this. This is the wrongest thing I have ever thought of and I've ever learned about. And I will put everything in me to try and stop these wrongs, to prevent future stories of injustice, of harm. And the last 25 years or so, that's what I've been doing because it is so wrong. And so it's those stories, though, these people's stories that moved me. The facts and figures, yeah, they back up. The evidence is so important and it's strengthened that, but it's those stories. It's seeing this man's heartbeat across a crowded conference room floor that will it's forever etched in my mind. Just like Cynthia now, hearing your story, hearing your daughter Mackenzie in my head saying, "Mom, go," it's forever going to change me. So that's how I got into it.
Thanks, Susi. And as with Cynthia, reminding us of how important having that sort of visceral, tangible connection to the human consequences of nuclear weapons is so crucial. By contrast, it seems that nuclear policymakers and apparently one president after another and leaders throughout the 9 nuclear armed nations continue mostly to think about nuclear weapons and potential warfare in these major abstractions, without really thinking of the mass destruction that would be done. So let's turn to Ira now.
Well, first of all, I just want to say what a privilege it is to be here in this program honoring Daniel Ellsberg. I had the privilege to work with Dan for many years, and not only was he one of the bravest people I've ever known, but he was also one of the kindest, gentlest, most generous people I've ever known. And it is very rare to find that combination of someone who actually changes history in his public life and is also a wonderful human being. So it's just a real privilege to be able to be part of this program honoring him. My own introduction to work trying to prevent nuclear war is not as dramatic as either Cynthia's or Susi's, but it goes back a long ways. I was born into a Jewish family shortly after the end of World War II and grew up from a very early age deeply aware of the Holocaust and deeply imprinted with the idea that the Holocaust had been possible not only because of the evil actions of the Nazis, of the bad people, but because of the inaction of so many good people who just didn't get involved and do what they needed to do. And so, I mean, this was put forward in my growing up as an absolute imperative that you cannot be silent in the face of evil. So when the civil rights movement developed in the United States, when the movement to stop the war in Vietnam developed, it was just a requirement. I had to do what I could do. And it was the same with nuclear weapons. Some years later, when I was a young doctor and I read about the medical consequences of nuclear war in a series of articles that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, it just became clear to me that this was the Holocaust writ large, the ultimate disaster for humanity, and that since I knew about it, I now had a responsibility to do something about it. And as a physician, the job that I took on, many other people in the physicians movement, was to teach people about the medical consequences of nuclear war, to try to help people understand the flesh and bone consequences, to get this out of this sterile conversation where nuclear weapons are talked about like chess pieces instead of agents of incredible human suffering. And, I've done that kind of work ever since then, trying to, during the period after the end of the Cold War, to keep alive the idea that nuclear weapons had not gone away, that they were a continuing danger. And over the last decade, as that reality has become clearer to people, to help, again, spread the word as widely as possible. One of the things that Cynthia said that I think has really struck me as very important she had not thought about the reality of nuclear war. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, Cynthia, but to me, this is really the nub of the problem. We all have enormous difficulty imagining this, getting our arms around the enormity of the danger that we face. I talk about nuclear war all the time. I know it's going to happen. I know that people like William Perry tell us it's going to happen if we don't do something very different. But despite that, in my heart, I don't believe it's going to happen. I just can't imagine everything being destroyed. And somehow or other, we need to get past that denial. We need to embrace that reality, as painful as it is, and understand in the part of our brain that motivates our behavior that these facts that we know abstractly really are true, that these consequences actually will happen to all of us if we don't do something to prevent nuclear war. One last quick reference to the Holocaust. At the Holocaust Museum in Washington, there are many incredibly powerful exhibits, but the one which I find the most terrifying is a corridor. I've not been there for many years. I hope the exhibit is still there. A corridor that you walk down, and the walls on both sides are lined with pictures taken in one small Jewish Polish town in the years just before World War II. And they're just normal, the kinds of pictures everyone takes of parties, of bar mitzvahs, of weddings, of graduations, normal people enjoying normal, simple pleasures. And you look at these pictures and you know that within 2 years, 95% of the people that you're seeing these pictures were dead. And you know that some of them had some inkling of the danger that they faced because they could see what was happening next door in Germany. And they went about their lives, which at one level is very important, but at another level kept them from saving themselves. And when I look at those pictures, I think that's us. That's what we're doing. We're sleepwalking through this incredible danger, and we're not doing the things which we can do and which we must do to get rid of these weapons before they get rid of us. And so, that exhibit kind of brought things full circle for me. That lesson of the Holocaust, not only is it imperative that we resist evil, that we take action, but it's also imperative that we understand fully the danger that we're facing.
Thanks, Ira. Your reference to the Holocaust reminds me of a passage in Ellsberg's The Doomsday Machine, where he's describing a moment in 1961 when he was consulting the Kennedy administration on the US plans for general nuclear warfare. And he asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff if they had an estimate of how many enemy people, enemy being cast 99.9% civilian, would be killed if we did go forward with our basic plan, which, by the way, would be an all-out nuclear strike on Russia and China and Eastern Europe, even if it was just the Soviet Union that had initiated aggression, say, in Eastern Europe. Even non-nuclear an attack would have been met, this was the plan, with an all-out nuclear attack by the United States. Well, their answer was in the form of a graph. Dan saw this. It showed how many people would die immediately and then over time through radiation, and the total was 600 million. And Dan's, even though he was a supporter of nuclear deterrence and an insider, he said a paper like this should not exist. This is the equivalent of 100 Holocausts. And at that time, let's remember, there was no idea of nuclear winter, which would, of course, led to perhaps complete extinction, or at least near extinction. So I do intend for us to talk a little bit more hopefully about positive things that are being done and still could be done to eliminate these threats. But let's sit a little bit more on some of the negative consequences. What would maybe it would be useful to talk a little bit about nuclear winter, and what it is and what the consequences would be, even in a relatively small nuclear war. say, between India and Pakistan. Any of you could certainly take that on. I know, Ira, you've done a lot of work on this. Maybe you could respond.
Sure. It's one of the most disturbing things that we have learned in the last decade or two about nuclear war. The more we look at it, the worse it is. But in 2006, a group of climate scientists led by Brian Toon and Alan Robach looked at the question of nuclear winter again. And they found that the more advanced computers and more advanced climate models then available to them not only confirmed the original 1980s predictions that a war between the US and Russia would cause a nuclear winter, but they also looked at what would happen if there were a more limited nuclear war, as might take place between India and Pakistan. And what they found was that the smoke from the fires that would result from that conflict would also be enough to cause widespread climate disruption. Not a full nuclear winter, but enough reduction in the sunlight hitting the surface of the earth, enough cooling, enough drying of the atmosphere to lead to a global famine. And we did a study back at the time that predicted that up to 2 billion people would be at risk of starvation. We couldn't specify exactly how many people would die, but that was the number that we thought would be in the category who would be at risk of dying. In 2022, just last year, a group of scientists led by Lily Jia at Rutgers published an incredibly important study which actually quantitates the numbers of people that will die if there's a war between India and Pakistan. They looked at a number of different scenarios depending on how many weapons were used, how large the weapons were. The bottom line was that a war in South Asia that involves 250 warheads, each of 100 kilotons. There are more than that in the Indian and Pakistani arsenals today, and those arsenals are growing. But that war, 250 warheads, each of 100 kilotons, would put enough soot into the atmosphere, 37 million tons, to create a global famine that would kill 2 billion people, a quarter of humanity, including 130 million people here in the United States. And this is something that could happen literally any day. There is fighting almost every day, low-level fighting, on the border between India and Pakistan. And that could easily escalate into a war between the two countries. They fought 4 full-fledged wars. And if there is another war, it is almost certain that that war will involve nuclear weapons and will escalate to the kind of disaster I was just describing. This should be the highest priority of the United States and every other country in the world to keep this from happening. And the only way we can make sure it happens is to get rid of all the nuclear weapons. And it is one of the great mysteries of our era that this is not the highest priority of any of the governments in the world today. And that's what our job is, to change that. You know, internationally, ICANN has led this extraordinary civil society campaign to bring about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which bans the possession of weapons, production of weapons, financing the production of weapons, and so on. The treaty has now been ratified by, I believe it's 69 countries. And this is an incredibly important watershed moment in history where the non-nuclear nations have come together and said, enough, you've got to stop doing this. We have to make these weapons illegal. The issue is that none of the 9 nuclear states have joined the treaty yet. And we need to focus on getting them to meet their obligations, to get rid of the nuclear arsenal so they too can be part of this treaty regimen. And I think for those of us who live in the United States, there's a particular responsibility because we are the country where there is, at the moment, the greatest possibility of civil society affecting the policies of our government. And, you know, here in the States, we've launched this campaign Back from the Brink to bring about that fundamental change in US nuclear policy. And that's one of the things that gives me some hope for the future.
Thank you. All right, I want to come back to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but you'd mentioned that some people are not fully aware of the potential for a nuclear war, and it's my sense that most American discussion of nuclear weapons over the last since the Cold War really has been to raise the specter of a subnational terrorist group getting their hands on a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb, or some rogue nation like North Korea using it. But not really much continued serious attention to how we might use it, or Russia, the two nations that have by far the most weapons. So I'm wondering maybe if Cynthia could say a few words about the relationship between the US and Russia, not just over Ukraine, but even prior to I mean, that's made things worse, but drawing our attention to that as an ongoing potential threat, never mind China and US over Taiwan, you know, Korea, all these other potential disastrous confrontations.
Thank you, Chris. You know, I've been concerned about this now for some time. And, you know, growing up, at the end of the Cold War, as I said, I thought that by getting rid of 80% of our arsenals, you know, we were on our way. And then that all changed. And so for me, it's kind of a deja vu. Can this really be happening? Are we really back to this point? And it's actually more dangerous in many ways than it was back then for a whole host of reasons. And I think that because the US and Russia together possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and because they possess the capacity, they possess weapons that can be, that are on what's known as hair trigger alert, that can be set off due to a false alarm. And there's this incredible risk of accidental nuclear war if that happens, which will be catastrophic. And so that risk has never gone away since, you know, that when the Cold War ended, that risk stayed with us, and we still had 20% of our arsenals, right? And that's way more than many times over enough to destroy life on the planet. So we still have, that was a huge accomplishment and really happened. It was a remarkable achievement, but we still have a really long way to go. So I guess for me with Russia, you know, I started going there in the 1970s, and I've always been worried, and I continue to be worried about this risk of accidental nuclear war due to blunder, miscalculation, mistake, human or computer error that might trigger a false alarm. And, you know, the experts say the probability is low. That's in sort of normal times, when we're not in high conflict times, but it's not zero, even if the probability is low when we're not in conflict. And anything greater than zero is an unacceptable risk for me when we're talking about nuclear annihilation. Anything above zero is unacceptable. And I do want to come to Ukraine because what is of greatest concern to me, both in US-Russia relations and in terms of nuclear dangers today, is the constant daily elevated risk of escalation to a nuclear confrontation over the war in Ukraine. And I do think the risk is considerably greater than it was before February 24th, 2022. And it will remain so as long as the war goes on. This for me is such an incredibly dangerous situation. Just to give a couple of little points here, last fall, Leon Panetta, who was the former US Secretary of Defense and former CIA director, said that, this is last fall, that some intelligence estimates believed that the probability of the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine had risen from 1% to 5% at the start of the war to 20% to 25% last fall. Okay, as I said, any risk higher than zero is unacceptable, but up to 25%, I mean, this is just crazy. It's insane. And there's so many pathways to escalation in this fog of war, whether by accident or intention. So much can go wrong. And I know this was of great concern to Dan from the start of the war. In a conversation we had in March, he said that the longer the war goes on, the greater the likelihood of the US and NATO being drawn into the conflict in one way or another. And of course, this worried him that this could escalate to nuclear war. And just last week, RAND, where Dan worked for many years, there's a link that'll go into the chat, came out with a study assessing the current risk of escalation in Ukraine. And just to share a couple of their key findings, the first one I think that's really important for people to hear is the quote, "The fact that Putin has avoided certain escalatory options to date does not mean that he will avoid them in the future." We don't want to believe that, but that's that's what they're saying, and I feel that I do agree with them. And regarding the risk that Putin could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the report says the risks to the Kremlin would be enormous. I'm quoting, but a sudden deterioration of Russian forces or a threat to internal stability could lead Putin to view nuclear weapons as the best among a set of bad options. Should he choose to take that risk, he may not be restrained in the number or types of weapons he uses in Ukraine. The report says also that the US ability to control future escalation may diminish. And they recommend that we maintain really good diplomatic and military channels of communication so that in the moment of crisis, we could stop an escalatory spiral. So I'm really concerned that we don't have good diplomatic channels of communication right now. In fact, as far as we know, there really aren't any ongoing channels. And I'm worried that we're not talking about nuclear risk. I was worried about this before the war. There wasn't enough dialogue about that. You know, nuclear risk 101 is that you never stop talking to your nuclear adversary about nuclear risk. And so that we're not talking adds to the risk of escalation. In a moment of crisis where there's a fog of war, talking is what saved us during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We wouldn't be here having this conversation if that backdoor channel hadn't been opened up between Bobby Kennedy and Ambassador Dobrynin, direct lines to Khrushchev and Kennedy. And so these are the reasons that I'm very concerned today, right now, about the risk of escalation in Ukraine. And this is why this is what worries me most right now on a daily basis.
Yes, and in the climate of war, the chances of an accidental triggering does go up. And you told the story of the Hawaiian false alarm. That was just one of many close calls. It's worth noting that today is exactly the 40th anniversary of a moment of a near nuclear war that where we were saved by a Russian colonel named Stanislav Petrov. Anybody want to tell that story, or you want me to just quickly tell it?
Actually,
Yeah,
Chris, if I could jump in on this, because
sure.
this is a story, and there are a lot of parallels to today with this story. So Stanislav Petrov, his job, and I'm just going to paraphrase, his story has been covered in films. It's been told a lot of times. He's received lots of awards. He's known as there's a brilliant Danish film called The Man Who Saved the World that really goes into detail about Stanislav Petrov. So this is a guy whose job was to watch the incoming radar, and if he saw missiles coming in, to send the signal up the line to fire the missiles back. Right? That's the short version. And so he got the warning that it showed the missiles coming in, and he chose not to send the signal up the line to fire missiles back. He said, there must be something. This is wrong. There must be something with this. This can't be correct. And so he took a moment of courage. He broke the chain of command. He did not follow orders. And to be perfectly honest, his life was ruined after that. Because he stood up and because he didn't follow the system that was in place, because his job, you see the signal, you send the signal. And he didn't do that. Today's missileers are in a state where I'm not confident they would do the same thing. And so this is one of those risks of accident or miscalculation that I'm really worried about. When you look at just the guys, because they're mostly young men, and they're young men, right? 20, 21, 22, 23 years old, who spend their job, their working hours in remote bunkers, ready to end life as we know it. And the instance and reported instances of drug abuse, drug use, and suicides among these young men is shocking and painful. It's truly painful. And to think like Stanislav Petrov was an older man. right? When he made this decision 40 years ago, he was not 23 years old. Just thinking about, oh, you know, that girl last night, she wasn't very nice, or you know, oh, I can't pay, you know, my way this month because I'm not making enough money, even with my bonus pay for being a missileer. Like he was in a different system. Today's guys, and again, they are mostly young men, are in a place where they have the fate of the world on their shoulders. They probably don't think too much about the consequences because there's there's something also very attractive about nuclear weapons. They're godlike devices. There's a magic that they've been imbued with that we've heard tell about. Carol Cohn has written extensively about this, about the fetishization of nuclear weapons. And I wonder if today's guys would make that same decision that Petrov made. I mean, 1983 was a different time. Everybody knew that there were 80,000, 75,000 nuclear weapons in the world. The world could end. It was much more in the public conscious. We were much more together in what we understood as happening in the world, even though we were further apart in so many ways. The means of our communication, our collective experiences were a little bit more shared. So Petrov, amazing guy, the man who saved the world, highly recommend this brilliant Danish film. But when I think about the risks today, when I think about how quick that decision is between, oh yeah, do we launch or not? The presidential decision-making time on launching US nuclear weapons, what, 6 minutes? And that's terrifying to me. And that decision-making time is getting less and less because now information is moving much more quickly. The data analysis is happening much more quickly, but it's changing. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Susi. Just a word to the audience. I've got lots of questions, but at the top of the hour, I will start to look at the questions that are lining up in chat to ask some of yours. Something that Susi said reminded me of a statement made by General Lee Butler, a former commander of the Strategic Air Command who presided over a huge portion of the American nuclear arsenal. And he said in retirement that the only reason we escaped a nuclear war during the Cold War was a combination of dumb luck, the bravery and cool-headedness of a few individuals like Petrov, and perhaps divine intervention. And in other words, we weren't saved by some kind of, you know, the effectiveness of deterrence or that. It was we've just been very lucky, as Cynthia was saying about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think her emphasis on the importance of negotiation and talking, it really was that, not bluster and threats and ultimatums that saved the day during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a willingness to be a little flexible and to compromise and to make some deals, which maybe ultimately was what we're going to need to think about in Ukraine. I would like to ask now to each of you, really, because you're so committed to this cause and you every day have to think about all these sort of horrible scenarios, some of which we've described tonight. What gives you hope? What keeps you going? What makes you, you know, feel that maybe we can get rid of nuclear weapons, and how you respond to people who are, you know, not hopeful, but the opposite, saying, oh, there's nothing you can do about it. Who wants to jump in on that?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I'm hopeful that we can fundamentally change nuclear policy because we've done this once before. In the 1980s, 1983, Stanislav Petrov saved the world. He had to. We almost blew it up that night. We almost did the same thing 2 months later, in November of 1983. The US that year put Pershing missiles in Europe with the stated objective of being able to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. And less than 2 years later, Ronald Reagan sat down with Mikhail Gorbachev and announced that nuclear war could not be won and it should never be fought. And this was a 180-degree change in the nuclear policy of both of these countries that came about in less than 2 years. because millions of people were in the streets demanding the change, and because these two leaders were able to understand finally that unless they did something very different, there was going to be a nuclear war, and everything that they cared about was going to be destroyed. So if we did that once before, there's no reason that we can't do it again today. And it's important. We talk sometimes about nuclear weapons as though they're this godlike force of nature. They're not. They're little machines. They're about the size of the chairs we're all sitting in. And we have already dismantled 50,000 of them. We know exactly how to dismantle the 12 to 13,000 that are left. And all that it will take is the same kind of political change that we saw in the 80s. We could have a planet free of nuclear weapons by the end of this decade. And we need to do that because if we don't get free of nuclear weapons, we're going to have a planet free of human beings. But I think that's what keeps me going, what makes me hopeful. I truly believe that this is something that we can achieve and can achieve in a fairly short period of time. And what is different between 1983 and today is the level of public understanding. In 1983, millions of people were active because everybody knew what would happen if nuclear weapons were used. We don't have that understanding today, and in some ways that's our primary job, is to recreate that understanding in the general public about the enormity and the immediacy of the nuclear threat.
Yeah, Susi.
Yeah, I mean, Ira, you're once again brilliant and eloquent, and I agree with everything that you're saying here. I mean, it's a choice, and the thing is, it's a choice, but there are vested interests that are trying to keep nuclear weapons around. And I was thinking about this event and this chat we were going to have, and all that kept coming into my mind are what are the different ways we're going to monkey wrench the doomsday machine. Right. And I was just like, that's what I want to, that's that hope, that idea, that ability to just nudge it off its track and put us in a different direction. And we can choose which direction we go. It's a choice. And that is so hopeful. And but there are vested interests. There are, companies that are making profits by building new nuclear weapons. They are lobbying to keep nuclear weapons around. They're financing think tanks to sell the idea that nuclear deterrence is great. Well, anybody who tells you nuclear deterrence is great, anybody who tells you nuclear weapons are great, ask the question, who's paying them to say it? Because anybody really, once they think about it, once they think about the whole picture, will not say nuclear weapons are great. And this, it's crazy, but this is an existential fight that we can win that's actually pretty easy. And that's what boggles my mind. Like, this is just about making a different decision. It's not rejigging the entire global energy infrastructure. Right? This is easy.
Susi, could I follow up with you on this because of all your work on trying to get companies and banks to divest from nuclear war production? Could you talk a little bit about that and also clarify for me, to what extent is that also a part of this important treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons? That is to say, there's some teeth to that treaty that might really move us in the right direction?
Okay, this is my favorite thing in the world to talk about. So now you've just unleashed me. I will keep it brief though. So there are about 30% of the spending on nuclear weapons that happens every year. And it's like, what is it? It's 83 billion a year spent on nuclear weapons, or 83 billion last year. About 30% of that goes into the hands of private companies. So it's Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, RTX, which used to be known as Raytheon. New name, same shame. Honeywell, they're making profits from the production of nuclear weapons, right? They get these contracts, and they're long-term contracts. And every time they announce a contract, every time they provide a briefing to their investors, they say, watch out, if there's a US government shutdown, we're not going to get paid, right? We're going to have to furlough our own people. There's all of these caveats in their own contracts. They're not super profitable. A lot of these not over long term, and they have terrible issues around their own internal governance. That aside, I do not provide investment advice. Investors across the world are pulling their investments out of these companies because of their association with the production of nuclear weapons. And they're doing that because the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, explicitly prohibits any form of assistance with the development, manufacture, or production of nuclear weapons and nuclear explosive devices. So that's not just the radioactive bit, the nuclear part of the nuclear bomb. It's the delivery vehicle as well. That's the missiles, the submarines, that's the bomb. All of that, you cannot assist in any way the production. And during negotiations of the treaty, that was clarified, and states made it very clear they see that financing is a form of assistance. That's what's happened with other weapons prohibitions. A weapon is prohibited. Banks say, oops, we're not financing the company that makes this. And the company that makes it stops. Lockheed Martin stopped making cluster bombs and refused to make them again, even when asked to do so, because they couldn't access financing from investors because of that inhumane weapon production. And ACOM and Serco, two companies that used to be involved in the production of nuclear weapons, have stopped since the treaty went into effect because they can no longer access financing for their activities. So they no longer take contracts related to the production of nuclear weapons. So we're going to keep chipping at them. It's like 25 major companies, and we'll chip at them one by one until we get them all out of the nuclear weapons game. And that is one of the ways that I'm involved in tossing a monkey wrench into that doomsday machine.
Thanks, Susi. Based on some of the comments we're getting and questions, I just want to point out that we are recording this event, so that, and I'm hopeful that the chat links to all these important sites and documentaries and things will somehow be preserved so you can look them up later. One of the questions that pops up online is the possible impact of artificial intelligence on potentially raising further dangers and threats of a nuclear war starting because of some figure like Hal in 2001 believing that it's the best thing to do. Have you thought at all about that? Is that something we need to be worried about?
Well, in addition to Hal, there was Joshua, who is the computer in War Games, a 1983 movie, in which a hacking incident carried out by a high school student got a supercomputer started on the project of launching a nuclear war. The computer was smarter than many people. It came to the conclusion that the only way to win this game is not to play it. But I mean, we've been aware since that movie in the 1980s of the potential danger of computers doing very bad things with nuclear weapons. And clearly, the development of AI and of cyber technology in general has dramatically, I think, increased the danger of the kind of accidental nuclear war that Cynthia's been warning us about this evening. It's going to be, I think, easier to get rid of the nuclear weapons than to constrain the computer technology. And I think we really need to understand that. As Susi just said, this is a very simple task to get rid of this small number of nuclear weapons. And it's not like reorganizing the entire global economy or the entire global, cybersphere. So we should take the easy route and the definitive route and get rid of the weapons themselves.
Go ahead, Cynthia, if you wanted to chime in. You got to unmute yourself, Cynthia. Unmute, there you go.
I just wanted to add that I'm deeply concerned about the risk of AI and the integration of AI into nuclear decision-making tools. I interviewed some of the top experts on artificial intelligence and new weapons systems as part of this film I'd made 6 years ago. And you know, that one of the top experts told me that that was very likely that we would have AI impacting nuclear decision making, and that, you know, he could foresee a situation of an AI. He said within 5 to 10 years. This was 5 years ago at this point, so it's only a matter of time. And he said, you know, that in a moment the AI could say to the president in a moment of crisis, you know, I've run 1 million simulations. The best way for you to come out of this, even though it'll be very high cost, is to strike now with nuclear weapons, to strike first. And so that's terrifying. Imagine that with some of the presidents that we've had that have been playing around with nuclear threats, you know, and so you know, my nuclear button is bigger than yours, and you have an AI saying, you know, you got to do this because it's the right thing to do. What are we doing those? I mean, it again takes it to another level. And if you're following the accelerated development of AI, you know, there's so many top AI experts who are very concerned about it being out of control. Yeah. And that needing to have some kind of guardrails, which are almost impossible to create at this point. So that it's also with me. It's also another big concern for me right now.
Yeah. And there was it's been going on in Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union had something called the dead hand, which was this computerized effort to make sure that there was retaliatory capacity. It did have a human supposedly monitoring it, but anyway, that's a big issue. It's interesting you brought up this film. What was the name of that film, Ira? The war. I've seen it. What was it?
Sorry, War Games.
No, yeah, War Games. We've had a number of people in the Q&A were remembering the 1983 film, The Day After, with one of the questioners wondering if it would be useful in our current moment to create, you know, not just anti-war organizations and things like this, but a kind of broader culture of anti-nuclear dramatizations and scrutiny. I mean, that film really was, I think 100 million Americans, some huge number saw it. I may be wrong, but maybe if somebody could just briefly remind the audience what that film was. It's something about its impact and whether should we do that again?
I would like to address this for a moment if I can. I really think that Hollywood and movies made a huge difference in the 1980s. We didn't just have The Day After, although that was huge, and I'll come back to that. We had War Games, we had Threads, we had Testament, we had just a whole lot of movies that came out that really made nuclear war real and woke people up to the gravity of what's at stake. And the Day After was a television event in those days where 100 million people watched it at the same time, at the same night. And it depicted a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. And it's actually something that also I was talking about, you know, what gives him hope, and it also gives me hope about all what happened during the Cold War with Ronald Reagan. But after he watched that movie, he couldn't get out of bed the next day. Dan writes about this. He was so depressed, and it was a turning point for him. I mean, it really was. This was a man who was committed to the largest nuclear arms buildup in history up to that point, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. You know, it was such a dangerous time, and he underwent a transformation. And I think movies, personal experiences, personal stories like Susi shared about the Habakasha, awaken people to the gravity of what's at stake. It makes it personal and it makes it real. So I think we absolutely need Hollywood to step up to the plate and help us make a difference like they did back then.
And I would add to that, I totally agree with what Cynthia said. Hollywood has been actively not doing its job. They have been approached repeatedly over the last decade with scripts, with plot ideas for movies that would help people to understand the enormity of the nuclear threat, and they've chosen not to make those movies. And I'm hoping that will change. In general, you know, everybody has a greater awareness of the nuclear threat since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it would be an enormous contribution if the popular culture
Yeah,
would again start using its enormous influence to educate people.
I
But
think it's true in
I've got
publishing
to jump.
too. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I've got to jump in here because this summer, I mean, Christopher Nolan's blockbuster, his highest grossing film of all time, this movie Oppenheimer. Now it's a Hollywood blockbuster film, right? So it's not going to tell every piece of the story. But oh my goodness, has it opened a possibility to engage on questions of nuclear weapons that hasn't existed in quite some time. So I agree very much with Cynthia and Ira. There could be a lot more, and I personally would love to see some Netflix series, some stuff going on Hulu, some streaming things, right? But we have had a little bit of an opening this past summer with the Oppenheimer film that allows us to start asking questions that nearly crashed the website of our colleagues in New Mexico from the Tuscaloosa Downwinders Alliance, because so many people wanted to find out what's the backstory on this. Who were the people? This wasn't a wasteland. There is no such thing as an empty place. And they have, overwhelmed colleagues who have these experiences to learn more. So we need more of it, and we need to keep bringing it up. It shows up in bits and pieces, though. It was in The Diplomat, which was a Netflix series, recent questions about the risks of nuclear bombs in Europe being used to bomb Europe, because that's what they're for. There's little things that are starting to creep through. And unfortunately, it takes time. And now, I mean, we're just concluding a massive strike, right? So it'll take even longer to get some of this content out there. But I think the option and the opportunity exists. Unfortunately, though, a lot of it is rooted in that awareness that is much higher now, that Ira and Cynthia both just mentioned, because of the invasion of Ukraine. So now there's a desire to tell this story a little bit more because the risk is starting to feel a little bit realer. And that balance between making the risk feel real, but not crossing over away from risk into horrifying action, right? That's something that's always a bit worrying too.
Here's a comment and question that takes us from Hollywood back to the grassroots, but I think there are a number of people that have a similar question, but this happens to be, I hope you will forgive me for reading it. It says, hello, this is Lukey Ellsberg, Dan's youngest grandchild. It is marvelously moving to listen to people who knew Dan and who are dedicated to the work that was so important to him. I am a PhD student studying the history of civil defense preparations for nuclear war. Do any of you have advice for where young people can make themselves most useful in this movement? Where do you see urgent need?
I would love to answer that. Lukey, your grandfather was an ardent and early supporter of the Back from the Brink campaign here in the United States, and was really quite a passionate advocate for this campaign. This is a national effort to mobilize people at the grassroots level to bring pressure on the US government to change its nuclear policy. And it is organized, modeled on the ICANN campaign. We've brought together 450 NGOs at this point around the country who support this call for the United States to begin negotiations now with the other 8 nuclear-armed countries for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement so they can all get rid of their nuclear weapons and all join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This has also been endorsed by 70 cities across the country. There's a resolution in Congress, HRES 77, which now has 41 co-sponsors. And if people go to the website, preventnuclearwar.org, they can find out easily how to get involved in this campaign, which is designed to be very accessible to people of all ages.
Anybody else want to take on that, the question of what younger people, or anybody for that matter, could do to become active in this cause?
I'd love to throw something in here, because I was once a young person trying to figure out how to get involved. Now I'm a middle-aged person trying to figure out how to stay involved. And here's the thing. This is number one. There are so many people who share the belief that nuclear abolition is possible. So the first thing I want to say is, don't despair. You're not alone in believing that you can make change in the world. And if you think about all the stories and movies about time travel, right? How the misplaced flap of a butterfly's wing or the slightest sneeze just changes the course of human history. You can be the sneeze that changes the world, right? And it's something, it's really true. Like, we don't know at the end of the day what it is that will make that final change, that will make the choice, no nuclear weapons. Everything matters. And if you speak up, you can get involved with local city politics, you can get involved with federal politics, you can get involved by just putting a sign in your window or going around your community or putting something up at the local park saying, hey, anybody want to eat cake and talk about nuclear bombs and how we can get rid of them? Because all of these things can make a difference. I'm a big believer, especially in the age of Zoom, of kitchen table organizing, getting people together and talking about this problem. You have here, these are two brilliant experts who know so much about this issue. There are tons of resources. Get a study group, just ask a question, and bring it as your university. If you're in a university, is your university connected to nuclear weapons somehow? Can you get them to sign? We have a pledge, a university's pledge to stop being involved in nuclear weapons. Can you get them on board with that? Can you get your city to do something? We have city legislation in cities like New York that say they will divest their pension funds from companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons, or cities like Tacoma Park in Maryland that say they won't do business with companies involved in the production of nuclear weapons. Like, cities can do all sorts of things. And local politics is much more accessible.
So Susie,
there's lots of things.
Can anybody join ICANN, or Ira? Can anybody join Back from the Brink, or Cynthia? Can anybody join? Tell me the name again of the women's group that you're running, the mentoring group. What's the name of that again?
Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy.
Yeah. So I assume anybody can find these websites and join and get information and contribute on a local level to those groups.
Absolutely. I mean, anyone can join Back from the Brink, and ICANN. It's actually organizations that join ICANN, but there's enormous amounts of stuff that individuals can do, and the ICANN website is a terrific resource as well. It has all kinds of educational information on it also.
Yeah, I just want to say that everyone's welcome, and we love having new people involved. I mean, it's such a joy, and I think that one of the things that's so inspiring for me about this work is I just love the people in the movement. They're all really so amazing and wonderful and inspiring. And, you also can just, Lukey, start a conversation. It can come, we Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, who presided over the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN in 2017, says history is made by every single step we take every day. And, she says we all have spheres of influence. Think about, people in your community, in your school, and also your elected representatives. Elected representatives need to hear that we care. They have so many issues and priorities and things on their desk that congressional staff say, we need to hear from you. If we don't hear from you, we can't make it a priority because there are so many other things on our plate. So just starting a conversation about the nuclear threat, starting a conversation with your congressperson or their staff saying, what do you know about the nuclear threat? And are you worried about it? And what are you doing about it? And will you support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Will you support the other initiatives in the Back from the Brink campaign? Really just reaching out and starting a conversation. I love this story of this young barista in Washington, D.C., who was an activist, and she wanted to bring it into her work somehow. So she started making little images of nuclear mushroom clouds and things like that in her lattes. And it became a way to start a conversation. And because you never know in Washington, D.C., who you're going to be making a latte for. It could be a congressperson, it could be just about anybody. So somebody with influence, or an ordinary person who just wants to know what this is about. So it's a way, there are all kinds of creative ways to begin to have, these conversations. And that's what, that builds a movement. Susi talked about the kitchen table conversations, and we have a way now to be connected. Social media. There's so many ways that we can actually make a difference. And by reaching out to people on the other side of the world who are interested in this, connecting with people in the movement, it's such a powerful way to actually engage and get support. So that's another thing. The kinship in this movement is really, really inspiring. So
we have a number of questions about the treaty, about Ukraine, and about nuclear modernization, which all 9 nuclear armed countries are engaged in some form in this country, to the tune of a potential more than $1 trillion over 20 years, if I've got it right. So someone asks, how do you stop this $1 trillion modernization, especially to combine it with another question somebody's asking in light of the war in Ukraine? Why, he asks, would any future country be willing to give up its nuclear weapons in light of, facing neighbors like Russia?
In terms of the cutting the expenditure on nuclear weapons, I think we're only really going to win that battle when we win the fundamental battle of getting people to understand that nuclear weapons don't make us safe, that they're the greatest threat to our security. As long as people think, and many people do, that nuclear weapons protect us, they're going to be willing to spend money on them. And unfortunately, this notion of deterrence, the idea that nuclear weapons possess this magic quality that guarantees they'll never be used, is fairly widespread. It's certainly put forward, as Susi pointed out very powerfully earlier, by people who are paid to put that position forward by the arms industry. But it's gotten pretty widespread. There are lots of people who just take this as an article of faith. Deterrence works. We haven't had a nuclear war since World War II. And as long as people believe that, there's not going to be a lot of support for cutting the nuclear weapons budget. So I think we have to take on the big question. We need to win the conversation about, do nuclear weapons make us safe or not? And once people understand that they actually threaten our security, then cutting the nuclear budget follows very smoothly and directly from that understanding. So just in terms of the approach to that, and I will leave to Cynthia how we deal with the question of neighbors of Russia being willing to give up their nuclear weapons.
You got to unmute, Cynthia.
That's a really good question and an important one to ask, but I think we have to step back and look at how nuclear weapons helped create the situation in Ukraine, meaning that many experts agree that Putin wouldn't have ever invaded Ukraine without trying to use nuclear weapons as a shield, without his nuclear shield. And there's an article, I think it was posted in the chat about this. So nuclear weapons have helped create this conflict. And until we eliminate nuclear weapons, we're going to be facing this over and over again in other places, this possibility. The only way to eliminate the possibility of one person or 9 nuclear armed countries, unleashing nuclear Armageddon and holding the whole world hostage is to abolish, ban, and eliminate nuclear weapons. So, you take a bigger view on this, and you see that this could happen. We could have a situation with China over Taiwan. We could have a situation with North Korea. As long as we have nuclear weapons, people are they're going to be an option for use in war, and they're going to threaten us. And until we get rid of those weapons, that threat isn't going to go away. So it comes back to that security situation that Ira mentioned, that we need to understand that nuclear weapons make us less secure and have actually made us less secure in Europe and in Ukraine.
Right. And that there are deeper forms of real security having to do with human health and education and all these other things.
Well, just on that just on that point, that spending 1.7 trillion on on modernization, and when you think about the intersectionalities of other issues, and we think about, imagine what we could do with those resources if we were to convert and repurpose them and use them for things like addressing the existential threats of climate change and pandemics and education, healthcare, pollution, all the urgent things that need our attention. Imagine what we could do with those resources. So that's really what we need to see, is that those resources being spent on weapons can really make us truly humanly secure and address true human security.
Here's
There's
a question.
also,
Oh, go ahead, Susie. Yeah, just briefly,
yeah,
because there's one more question I
very
want to get to.
briefly. Just the fact that there's also, like, the UK is coming to a decision point right now whether they can afford to have an army or nuclear weapons. And it's like they can't afford both, right? So when it comes down to how wars are actually fought and the tools that are being used, not the tools that provide cover for proxy warfare or for illegal invasions, but the actual tools of warfare that are being used on the ground, they can't afford them. And that is a fundamental security decision that is coming to the fore in the UK, that's causing them to negotiate new cooperation with France and with the US to reduce their national budget costs and offset those onto others. And so there are, like, real security implications to spending this gross amount of money on nuclear weapons too.
Here's a question, not completely unrelated, but a bit different. Hello, I'm Chimoru. So I'm interested in hearing some of the panelists speak about the overlap of nuclear non-proliferation and indigenous sovereignty movements like those across the Pacific. I think Cynthia and Susi could certainly weigh in on that subject.
I'm going to start, Cynthia. So the legacy of nuclear testing has been born on the backs primarily of indigenous and politically disenfranchised persons, right? And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons actually has language to find ways to address those past harms to for the victims, victim assistance for those affected by nuclear weapons use and testing. And so it is a significant historical problem. It continues to be a problem because the extractives, the uranium mining, is also done primarily on indigenous lands, and leaves a contaminating legacy that has not been fully addressed or cleaned up. It's expensive and takes cooperation. But at least through the Nuclear Ban Treaty, there is starting to be global cooperation to help on this issue, because it is a horrible legacy of colonialism that has not ended and continues to be perpetuated, including through the continued possession and development and modernization of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I think had Mari Fain's been able to join us tonight, she would have really emphasized this, which is to say that while everyone knows that, yes, they were victims of actual atomic bombs in Japan, nuclear weapons have already done a lot of harm to people beyond Japan. I mean, downwinders, atomic veterans who are exposed to these tests, uranium miners, people poisoned at Hanford and Rocky Flats, where plutonium was being produced, and people being displaced from their lands. Literally moved off islands, to go back to the Pacific. So that's it's a legacy that is not much remembered, but is certainly central to this whole story. We have just 5 minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you just a chance to make a final short statement, either something that you haven't had a chance to say that you wanted to, or just to maybe summarize what your core feeling about this. Anybody who wants to jump in first is fine. Ira?
I said pick one of us, so you did. Sorry. I think there are three messages that we need to share with everyone. One is that nuclear war actually can happen, and that in fact it's going to happen if we continue on the path we're on. Secondly, that nuclear war, when it does happen, is going to be far worse than anything we can possibly imagine. And third, and most important, this doesn't have to happen. And I just think we really have to base ourselves on that final point. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. We have made these. We know how to take them apart. As Susi pointed out before, it's so much easier to get rid of these weapons than to reorganize the entire global energy economy. This is really a pretty simple problem. So for heaven's sake, let's do the things we need to do. Let's make our politicians and our leaders listen to us, and let's get rid of them. We can do this.
Cynthia. I gotta unmute Cynthia.
It's been a really inspiring conversation, and I'm so grateful to have had the chance to be a part of this. I want to go to Ambassador Tito of Kiribati, who said that the struggle for nuclear disarmament is the greatest love story to save humanity. And just to bring this back, yes, we need to awaken to the gravity of what's at stake. But really, this work is about love, saving all we love and hold dear. That's what's at stake. And we can write this story together. And we not only can, but we must. And I think it's the greatest way that we can honor Dan's legacy. And so I just invite everybody to write this love story together with all of us so that we can get rid of this and start taking care of the earth and each other.
Thank you, Cynthia. Susi.
So there is a plan, right? We have a treaty that makes nuclear weapons illegal, that sets a path for their elimination. There's a plan. It's working. And we just need more people to find their own piece of it and jump on board. We move fast. We have to keep moving fast, because moving fast is how we keep our opposition a little bit off balance, keep them on the back foot. And we have to have fun while we do this. We talk about heavy, heavy stuff. And I will tell you, it is not fun sometimes to talk about this heavy stuff. So we need to find ways to have fun while we do this work, to share the joy of what we want to protect from the dangers of nuclear weapons. And I'll end on this quote from Dan Ellsberg that I thought was just so perfect for this. He said, "We need the courage to face the truth about what we are doing in the world and act responsibly to change it." And I think we should absolutely do that and make sure we have at least a little bit of fun along the way. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all three of you. That was really, really wonderful. I also want to thank two behind-the-scenes people, program manager Ross Caputi and Kim Enderly, for helping out. And just if I could take a quick moment to tell you all about the next major event that we're going to be having on November 1st. We're going to screen the documentary National Bird about U.S. drone warfare, followed by a panel discussion with the filmmaker Sonia Kennebec, Lisa Ling, who is one of the whistleblowers featured in the film, and Jesselyn Raddick, who's an attorney that has represented many public interest whistleblowers. And that will be followed on November 15th with the second annual Ellsberg Lecture to be delivered by Norman Solomon, who many of you may know is a leader of Roots Action and a number of other activist groups, and the author of a recent book called War Made Invisible. So thanks again to my wonderful panelists, really appreciate it, and to the audience for your great attendance and wonderful questions and comments that you made. Thanks to all, and good night.